Today's guest is Pippa Ehrlich, the co-director of the Academy Award-winning documentary My Octopus Teacher. Back in 2016, Pippa had what many people would consider a dream job. She was traveling the world as a marine journalist with an ocean-facing room. But when she met filmmaker Craig Foster and accompanied him on a dive into the great African sea forest, everything changed. Despite having no guaranteed funding and no clear vision of what a collaborative film would look like, Pippa left her stable career to help Craig tell the story of an octopus, a story that would go on to captivate millions of people. And as they were diving into those frigid South African waters every day, Pippa said that she never felt more alive. And what's fascinating about this story is that for Pippa, it wasn't just about making a film. It was really about following an inner calling that defied practical logic. And in our conversation, we explore how taking that leap of faith led Pippa not only to an Oscar, but to discovering her true creative voice and purpose. So just before we started recording, you talked
Yeah.
about how stressful your latest work is. What aspect of your work is stressful?
I mean, filmmaking is a dream. It's like an absolute dream job. So I definitely don't want to sound too negative about it. And I think the thing about stress and pressure is it's often something that we're putting on ourselves. But it's quite a big responsibility to carry a big project that's got a lot of kind of expectation and money, and when you're directing something, you're leading this team of people, and they're all kind of relying on you to help them to make sure that this thing you create together is successful. And just for something, the idea that something has to be successful, particularly when it's so subjective, is stressful. And filmmaking, it's just, I mean, I speak to my filmmaking friends about this, and none of us really understand because we're not saving lives. But when you're in it, it really does feel like lives depend on this thing that you're doing, and your soul depends on getting it right. So there's a lot of pressure in that. And then particularly once you're into the kind of production phase of a film, it's just deadline after deadline after deadline after deadline, and you have to make so many decisions. I mean, definitely by the end of this last project, I just had absolute decision fatigue. If one more person asked me what I thought, or what I wanted to do, because in the beginning, it's this beautiful process where you're just kind of thinking about this thing and what it's going to become, and you're dreaming it up, and you're having very, very open-ended, wonderful conversations. But as it becomes more and more contained and constrained, it's amazing because it starts taking shape, and that's a really magical alchemical process. But as it starts taking shape, there's less and less freedom and more pressure, and wrong decisions are expensive in terms of time and money, and the pressure just mounts. So, and I think because I'm still becoming a filmmaker, you know, this is my third big film only. I've still got a lot to learn, so I do still make mistakes.
I've had my friend Ava DuVernay, who's also a documentary
I'm
filmmaker.
a massive fan.
Yeah, she was
Yeah,
on here as well, and she described being a director as you're the mayor of this town, and everything that happens in this town, from the
yeah,
emergency services to craft services to what a pothole in the street, everyone
yeah.
wants to. You have to be the one to kind of figure out what to do about pretty much
Everything.
everything. But when it comes to these deadlines, just for those of us who aren't familiar with how this whole thing works, who imposes the deadlines? Do you create deadlines for yourself, for the crew, or does the producer do it, or is it a
The
collaboration?
producer.
Or
No, it's a combination between the producer, and I'm going to work with an amazing producer called George Signal, who normally works with me when deadlines have to shift. But they have to keep the ship moving at the pace it needs to go. And then obviously when you're delivering to someone like Netflix, and you get closer and closer to the deadline, it's less and less flexible because they're dealing with a massive slate in a calendar that's going like 2-3 years into the future, and
You're just one tiny little town in the middle of all these
exactly,
massive cities.
yeah. Yeah, and you've signed a contract and you've agreed to get something done by a certain date. I mean, most people are really, really understanding, and everyone does the best they can to accommodate. But it's this giant moving jigsaw puzzle, you know, because obviously my time, I've got to worry about my time. But then if I want to work with a specific sound designer, then I need to make sure that I fit in with his schedule, and a specific colorist, I've got to fit in with his schedule. And then there's a DOP who I really like working with. So you got to juggle and balance all these things, because films are not made by directors or producers. Films are made by a massive team of incredibly talented, generally very, very hardworking, passionate people. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and when you discover that you love working with someone, and you can trust them, and you do powerful things together, you want to keep working with those people, and you want to make sure that the puzzle fits together in terms of everybody's timing. So yeah, that's kind of how the deadlines work. And one little thing, you'd be surprised, like how one thing can throw a whole schedule out. And then shame the producers have to work so hard to make up for that. Yeah, and I think directors are quite lucky in a way, because we have a huge amount of support around us, and people trying to really help us realize our vision, which is an incredible kind of strange privilege.
Mm-hmm. So just to juxtapose this, because I've done my research, and most of the things that have been written about you are written about you in your involvement with the Octopus Teacher, right? Obviously, and you mentioned things were very stressful. Now this is your third feature, so take us back to when you lost your feature film virginity with my Octopus Teacher.
Exactly. That's a really good way of describing it.
As being so alive, and you guys didn't have any money for a couple of years, and it sounds like it was a very different type of experience. It was piecemeal together. And even Ava talked about this when she did her first film on her own money, and she drove it out to the Palm Springs Desert Film Festival, and how freeing that was. And she's never had that feeling since that moment.
I know. It is. There's something about that total naivety that comes from your first project, when there's very little expectation from the outside world. And in fact, you haven't even considered what expectation from the outside world might mean at that point. You just like got this little magical thing. It's like a magical ball that's changing shape and changing color, and it's living in your head and in your hands and in your computer, and you're throwing it around with other people, and it's this incredibly exciting thing. And with Octopus Teacher, I mean, just the idea that someone had asked me to make a film with them, because Craig Foster was someone who I really, really admired. Just the idea that we were going to do this thing together was so exciting to me. I'd wake up in the morning and just be absolutely filled with energy. I just couldn't wait to get to work. And that was a very special film, also because it was about this place that I loved so much and continue to love so much. The Great African Sea Forest, which is the kelp forest where the octopus lives, and where Craig started diving every day. It's just this absolutely gorgeous ecosystem that has kind of been on my doorstep for the last 15 years, and is also very.
How far away is it from Simonstown?
I mean, I'm looking at it right now. It's a 2-minute walk from where I'm sitting right now, and it stretches. I mean, many places in Cape Town, that's the reality, because the South Peninsula is it's this town with a giant mountain in the middle of it. So everybody lives on the edges in the little strips between the mountain and the sea. So for many of us, the ocean is really close. And I grew up coming here because my grandparents had a house here when we were kids. So it's been kind of a part of my psyche since I was a child. But when I started diving intentionally and really getting to know the animals in this place and how the tides work and what the kelp forest is all about, it just caught my imagination in a way that I can't really describe. And it's so immersive. Being in the ocean is the most immersive thing you can imagine. You spend 1 hour underwater, and it's just a fully visceral experience from the tips of your toes to the top of your head. It's the way you're using your lungs underwater, the way you're using your body to move through the water, the cold and how that affects you. It's just, I suppose it's learning a whole new way of being. And I was very much at the beginning of that process when we started on Octopus Teacher, and then that project and my kind of relationship with the kelp forest were growing at the same time. And that was so powerful because you go out, dive and film for 2-3 hours a day, and then come back and sit in front of a computer and start editing all these things together. And bringing that footage back, it was like coming back with this little treasure chest and opening it up and seeing what we got. And it was exciting. Yeah.
I watched an interview of you and your co-director,
James Reed.
Yes. And he mentioned how when he first met Craig, he didn't get main character energy from Craig in a documentary. I'm wondering, what was your impression when your friend introduced you to Craig? What was your impression about him and what he was up to, aside from having the cool experience of swimming through the kelp forest, just as a person?
I mean, so I'd been following Craig's work for a long time, and I'd seen him do quite a few talks by then. So I was really intrigued by his kind of, Craig's world is magical realism. And actually, he's become a lot more science-based as time has gone on. But because he spent so much time with Indigenous people, because he's so incredibly creative and his whole world is about storytelling and making things, he's got this very magical way about him. And I think I can see why James would say he didn't get main character energy from him, because Craig is quite quiet. He speaks very softly. But he is this incredibly powerful force the more you get to know him. And from that very first dive, when we went out, and bear in mind, I've been coming here since I was a child, and I've been diving here. By then, I'd already been diving pretty regularly for like 8 years. But in 45 minutes with Craig, I saw more than I'd seen in all those years combined. He was just moving through that forest and noticing things. And I always say this, but I'm going to say it again. It was like putting on a pair of magical goggles. And suddenly there are all these creatures that you never dreamed existed. And he knew how to find them. And he understood what they were doing. And he could tell you a story about each and every one of them. And it just brought this place to life in a totally 3-dimensional, multi-layered kind of way. So
how would it work on like an actual mechanical basis? Would he talk to you for like an hour beforehand, and then he would tell you what to look for, and then you would hold your breath and go down there and then come back up, and then he would say, "Did you see it?" And then hold your breath again and go back down again. Like what was
well, that's kind of what it's like when you free dive together. So I mean, you tracking along the shore and looking at things like in the intertidal zone, just at the edge of the water. And then there are also incredible things that you can see in this much water, like especially at low tide. You can find octopus. You can find this incredible little tuberculate cuttlefish, which is like this big, but it is the cleverest little creature you ever imagined. It can change color. It can make its whole body spiky, so it looks like a little tiny hedgehog, but also completely blends in with the bits of algae around it. It can pretend to be a snail. It can pretend to be a fish. It's just the most unbelievable creature. And many of the ones we see the babies and they're like as big as your pinky nail and they're doing all this crazy shit. So yeah, you kind of going on an adventure together and you're looking for things and you're talking about them and you are sometimes identifying mysteries and then solving them together. You know, sometimes you'll find like a little collection of eggs on a kelp stipe and then you spend the next 2 or 3 weeks trying to figure out who laid them. So that's how it works. Craig, what did he tell me early on? He said something like, go out and take a picture of every single animal that you see and then identify it and write a story about it. Do some research, write a story about it. And then once you start to realize what's normal, you'll start to see what's unusual and what's special. And that's when a place really starts to come to life. That's when you start to realize, this octopus is not like the other octopuses, you know.
You must have impressed him as well. I mean, because he's taken a lot of people out, and you know, there's something about you that he felt connected to in terms of a storyteller. Since he obviously invited you to join him in this project, that he didn't really even know what it was at that time. So, what do you imagine he saw in you?
It's an interesting question. I think we do. I mean, Craig and his wife are almost like my Cape Town parents, I say. So there's a deep love between Craig and Swati and me, and they are very kind of kind and nurturing to a lot of young people. I don't know. I think Craig, he must have seen that I was hungry and like very, very keen to sink my teeth into something. I think I was very, very dedicated to the diving. I adapted to the cold really quickly. I've always been I'm useless on land. I'm like incredibly clumsy. But underwater, that's where my superpowers come out. And I think the other thing, which Craig recognized, which is very powerful, is when you are in your late 20s, which I was at the time, and you've had all these ideas and all these dreams and all this creative energy has been like building up inside of you, and you haven't had a chance to express it, that's a very powerful force. And I think he could see that. And I think I had this like enormous reserve of energy and creativity, and I could just pour that into the project in a completely naive and sort of unmeasured way. And that's what Octopus Teacher was like. It was like just turning on a tap and giving it everything you had.
Hey, so a lot of you all have been reaching out with your guest suggestions. And look, I appreciate it. I do. And to help make it easier for those guests to say yes to my invitation, I need you to subscribe to this channel. Just hit the subscribe button below, and that's literally the best way to help me get you that guest on my podcast. All right, thank you so much for helping out, and back to the show. The part of your story that I'm super fascinated by is you had a job before all of this.
Yeah.
You had you traveled around the world. You had
a really nice job.
Office.
Yeah.
Really nice job. Yeah. So, you know, on paper, I'm sure it looked like you were living your purpose. You were living your dream. You were doing something that you were passionate about, everything that people talk about these days. And yet there was this other opportunity. And I guess I'm wondering, you know, at that inflection point, what was that decision process like for you? And did Craig give you any advice? Because he's been around the block, you know, many times, and he kind of knows these things could or couldn't go anywhere. Maybe they don't make any money. There's no money in the budget. But you felt inspired to take this leap of faith. Can you just unpack that moment and what you were thinking? And because again, you had anxiety, and you know, I don't know what else was going on. Maybe there was a little bit of depression, perhaps.
It was a 2016. It was a difficult year for me because of many different things. One of them being the death of a close friend of mine to a drug overdose, a ketamine overdose, and that really shook it shook me up and it shook my whole kind of group of friends up. But what was happening at the same time was I had this incredible job. And I was traveling around the world and I was talking to the most fascinating scientists all over the world, marine biologists. And I was hearing about the relationships that they had with the environments that they worked in and the animals that they worked with. And I kind of felt a bit voyeuristic. And what I found on that first dive with Craig was suddenly I felt like I was inside something and I was experiencing it directly. And that switched something on in me. And I wanted more and more of it, I guess. And then, because that's a strange thing about journalism, often you are a filter for things rather than having those experiences yourself. Unless, I suppose, you're a conflict journalist and you're right deep inside of things. But I don't know, maybe I was looking for my own voice and I felt like through these experiences I was having underwater, I was starting to find it. And when it came to making the film, nothing about it made sense, saying yes to that opportunity, to doing that. There was no money. I had this really good job. I had a big scholarship opportunity at that time as well, which I had to turn down. But the minute I read the treatment that Craig sent me, it was like the easiest decision I've ever made. It was like every part of my body, there was just no way I was going to say no. And that doesn't happen often in life, where you have a big decision to make and it's just so clear what you need to do.
Who did you
It's
talk
happened
to
to me.
about this? Who did anybody give you any advice, suggestions?
I didn't even ask for advice. And that's very unusual for me. That's really, I usually ask everybody for advice.
That's how you
I
know. That's how you
struggle.
know. You don't need to
Yeah.
ask anybody for advice.
I didn't know. Yeah, I didn't need to. It's very strange.
So how are you
And
going
I
to pay your
usually
bills?
struggle with that. I saved some money. And then it was just like little miracles happen. So Sea Change Project was just the organization that Craig had founded, which I now work for as well. They managed to scratch together like just enough money that I could pay my rent every month and my medical aid. I couldn't even put petrol in my car. I ended up sleeping in Craig and Swati's basement for 2 years for most of the time because the fuel to get from my house to their house every day was too much. I mean, by the time we got our first payment for Octopus Teacher, there was literally not a cent on my credit card, not a cent in my savings account. It was like I had literally run out. There was nowhere left to turn.
What did your parents
Um,
think about this decision and about this, this
my
experience of you
parent,
losing all this money?
well, I think my parents have thought they've never really thought that I made much sense since I was a little kid. And they were actually very supportive. They were kind. If we went on family holidays or to family weddings and things like that, they just knew that they had to pay for everything and I couldn't, which I'm grateful for. But I'm not sure what they thought. But I think my parents are kind of accountants and engineers. So my life path is a surprise to them. Yeah, but they were in Joburg. They were absolutely horrified that I was diving in such cold water all the day, all the time. That was the thing they were the most resistant to: the cold
Right.
water and the sharks, which
One
are
other
very
thing that didn't
harmless.
make sense to me was why did Craig need a director? He's already a director. He was
So
closer to this project than anyone.
it's a good
So why did he
question.
bring you in?
Well, I don't think like when I came in, I wasn't going to be the director. I thought I was going to be carrying the tripod and backing up the footage, holding the boom pole, which I'd done on many shoots. So what's amazing about Craig is how inclusive he is and how I wish I could remember this quote, but there's something about like an amazing, the most incredible thing is to find a person who sees like the person some part of you knows you could become, I suppose. And Craig was just, he believed in me and he took me seriously, which is quite incredible for someone in their late 20s.
Right.
Most of
You must have
us,
had
like,
a major imposter syndrome as well, I imagine, right?
not at that point. I wasn't even thinking like that. That came later. Um, no, I was just having so much fun. And we had this amazing creative synergy, and we were finding incredible things on the hard drives and seeing amazing things in the water. And I mean, we created some really wild sort of dream sequences which never made it into the final cut, but we were just having so much fun. So I didn't expect to be the director. And Craig's, he doesn't really work on a hierarchy. Even in Sea Change, there's not much of a hierarchy. We were just the filmmakers and we were doing it together. And then we did a cut, which was kind of co-directed by Craig and I, and he'd voiced everything over, but something about it just wasn't landing right. It was almost like without seeing him on camera, you couldn't get a authentic enough sense of who he is and this thing that he'd been through. So then we had to conduct an interview. And that's when James Reed came on board. And you can't, when you know someone so well and when you know the story so well and they know you know the story so well, it's really hard to interview them, which is a big lesson that I learned. Because for me, the best kind of interview is when somebody sits down and tells their story to someone who's never heard it before. And that's what James Reed kind of pulled out of Craig in a really, really powerful and emotional way. And at that point, I think Craig also realized that he was now so close to this thing. And it was all so dependent on his kind of screen personality that he couldn't direct it anymore. It's very hard to be on camera and to judge yourself fairly, I think. I think it makes you very, very, very self-conscious. And no matter how kind of evolved or mature you are, it's challenging. He didn't want to be, he wanted to tell the story, but I don't think he wanted to be so upfront as he was in the end.
Right. Which obviously was, pivotal to the success, I think, of the documentary. But I'm just, I don't really know you. I don't know Craig at all, but I imagine, I just want to imagine what Craig saw in you, just from what I've read about you so far. Because my objective with this podcast is to help other people do what you did. Take a leap of faith, follow some inner urge where you don't have to ask people's advice about it. It's so clear to you, although you don't know how it's going to turn out, right? And a lot of times that may look like a collaboration with someone who's got a lot more experience than you. And, I've been in that situation. You've probably been in that situation now where someone else is coming up behind you.
Yeah.
And they don't have as much experience, but they're willing to show up. They're willing to forego the wetsuit. They're willing to follow the instructions without question. They're willing to be curious.
Yeah.
They're willing to go above and beyond, do the research. And this stuff impresses people who have had all this experience. Maybe they're a little bit jaded, by the industry. And so you have this fresh face. And I think you could probably collaborate with anybody you wanted to if you just are willing to show up and go the extra mile and be curious and carry the tripod if that's what's required. Don't have an ego, don't have an attitude, et cetera, et cetera.
I think that's a really beautiful way of putting it. And I'm working with a couple of younger filmmakers at the moment who it's just an absolute joy to engage with them. And yes, they're very talented, but more than that, they're just incredibly reliable and open and humble. And if I call them at 11 o'clock at night, which I try not to do, but sometimes I'm just very enthusiastic about it and just about things, and or sometimes the project actually requires that, and they answer their phone, and they show up, every single time, and they make mistakes, and then they work really hard to fix those mistakes.
Right. You take feedback well.
Yeah.
You have humility. You show
Yeah.
up. I mean, that's such a rare trifecta of qualities. You could work with anybody, and then you'll be like at the top of that
Yeah.
thing very, very soon. If you just do those three things, just show up, be humble, and take good feedback without being offended.
And be curious. Like
Be
get excited
curious.
about the thing.
Ask questions. Ask good questions.
Yeah. Yeah, and
Where
it's
did that come
interesting.
from
Sorry,
with? Where did that come
with
from with
me.
you? Is that something you've been your whole life, or is there something about Craig that brought that out of you?
No, I think I've always been a hard worker. I think I was really grateful to have found this thing that was just making me feel so good, so excited to be alive. I mean,
Hmm.
what more can you ask for from a project or from a relationship with someone than this feeling of, oh my God, I'm just so excited to wake up in the morning because this thing is motivating me so much. I can't wait. There was a bigger thing as well with Octopus Teacher, where I'd been working as a conservation journalist for 4 or 5 years at that point. I'd been working in TV journalism for even longer. And I had become jaded with the way we were telling stories, and frustrated with this idea that you've got to give people facts and then hope that they take those facts on board and change the way they engage with the world. And what was so exciting about Octopus Teacher is, yes, we could give people facts, but we could also take them on an incredibly emotional, beautiful, magical journey that might just have a chance of touching their hearts and changing the
You
way they
know,
think about things.
I find that when you try to make people laugh, or when you try to touch someone's heart, or when you try to, motivate, it doesn't oftentimes land in the
No,
way that you envisioned it. So instead, it's more about just being honest. And I found that
being
in that
honest.
film, like learning about Craig's depression was really,
Mm.
I found that was, I don't know if that was a part of the original storyline, but,
It
or if
was.
he
That was something
resisted.
he no, he didn't resist. Maybe now he'd say he resisted when he looks back on it, but I think he'd gone through this massive healing.
Yeah.
And I also think that telling your story can be very healing.
Hmm.
So maybe that's what he was looking for. But I think storytelling, our brains are wired to listen to stories and make sense of reality through stories. So as you say, if you can just tell a really honest, moving, powerful story without being too focused on what the outcomes might be, that's your best shot at having an impact.
Was there anything? I'm sure you suggested a lot of things, but is there anything that they resisted, Craig and James, and you were like insistent on, we have to add this or do that, and it ended up making it into the story?
I mean, there were lots of things. Um,
Talk about your
but
decision making
not.
process between the three of you. Like, how would you decide where we go
Yeah.
with this and where we don't go with that?
Well, there was one main thing, and I think this is actually something that James and I were aligned on, which
Hmm.
was really good because there were lots of things we weren't aligned on. But Craig and Swati wanted the film to have a more overt conservation message.
Mm,
And we had a lot going on at that time around a big octopus fishery in the bay
right.
that was killing whales. And we ended up going out and filming these horrible images of these like bloated whales that had been caught in fishing lines. And there was a big opportunity to build that into the story and then have a very, very clear, call to action
Hmm.
around octopus fishing. And that was one thing that I was very, very clear about. I didn't want, because I felt like what would happen at the end of the film, if we made it issue based in that way, is that people would come away from it and instead of thinking about like how they felt about the story and where they landed and how
Hmm.
it made them think about their relationship with nature, they'd end up feeling angry and like they had somebody to point their fingers at and like they had a bad guy to project all of their frustration onto.
The pajama shark. That's that's the villain
Yeah,
of
and
the
I feel
film.
and pajama sharks are my favorite frigging Kelp forest animals. So I still feel bad that they came out looking like the bad guys because they are so cool.
Hmm.
Um, so that was one thing. Craig is very open. He's an amazing person to work with because he very seldom shuts you down,
Hmm.
and I've learned
So
so much
he's
from that.
conceded that that was the right call when it's all in hindsight.
Yes, and
Yeah.
I guess James and I were on the same page, and I think Netflix agreed with us. So
Yeah. So
yeah.
speaking of that, okay, so again, you hear all about this bureaucracy with like when you start to get involved with a company like Netflix, they've
Mm.
been there, done that. You're just one of, thousands of documentary filmmakers.
Yeah.
What is that like with them taking your precious little baby that you guys have been, incubating and giving birth to, and then they're putting their whole whatever behind it. But then, of course, they have all these other suggestions. I'm sure the thing poster needs to look like this. The title needs to
Yeah.
be that. Like, did they
Yeah.
start imposing all these things, and you guys are start like, oh my god, I don't know if that's the right call.
So with Octopus Teacher, we had an incredible executive producer at Netflix called Sarah Edelson. And I think it was really cool for her as well because she just joined the company and they kind of let her take Octopus Teacher on because it
Hmm.
was like her first project and they wanted to give her something that could be hers. So I think Octopus Teacher was referred to as Sarah's little passion project
Right.
at
Low
Netflix.
low stakes. Way to for her to basically learn on the job.
Kind of like that. For her to do something that she was like charmed by, I
Hmm.
suppose. Um, and I didn't feel very pushed around by her. I mean, their standards are very high,
Hmm.
so that's one thing. Um, the first cut that Craig and I submitted after the rough cut that kind of we'd worked on with James Reed actually got rejected,
Hmm.
and that was a terrible feeling.
On the
That's
basis of
that. It just wasn't polished enough.
they said
It
we
wasn't
don't want it,
ready.
or you have to go back and do these 10 things and then it'll be
Yeah.
ready.
So how it works is you've got to do 4 cuts for Netflix. So they get to make
Mhm.
feedback on 4 different versions of the film. And this would have been version 1, but we weren't ready. We submitted it too early. There were things in it that weren't working. Um, and that was when the imposter syndrome started to kick in, I would say, from that
Really?
point. Yeah. But this is where the amazing thing about teamwork comes in. And we brought in a consulting editor called Jinx Godfrey, who is multi Academy and Emmy Award winning editor. And she became like the fairy godmother at that point. And she and I, there was no Zoom at the time. It was so long ago. But we sat
Skype.
on WhatsApp. Well, it was
Hmm.
actually WhatsApp calls and we talked through sequence after sequence after sequence and we kind of pulled it together. Um, and that's another thing, another incredible mentor to have someone who is so experienced and so good at what they do, like hear you out and take your ideas seriously and help you figure things out. Um,
What's
Yeah, it was
something that they
really.
added in the film that you think made it what it is
I
that
mean,
you
I
wouldn't have
think
had otherwise if you hadn't done that, gone through scene by scene?
so. I think we had too much to begin with. So
Hmm.
so rather than adding things in, Jinx helped us take things out, and she helped us put them in the right order. And
Mm.
that's what good editing and good storytelling is really about. It's someone said to me, a film is like a poem. It
Hmm.
gets better when you take things away.
Mm.
Um, and I think also when you've got that distance, bear in mind at this point, I'd been deep in that kelp forest for 3 years. I was so in the
Right.
weeds. I was so attached to so many things.
Right.
So when you have
Everything is
someone who's
significant.
on,
Yeah.
everything felt significant. So to have someone on the outside who was kind and who was thoughtful, who I trusted, who kind of guided me around what I needed to let go of and how I could make it better was super powerful.
Hmm.
And I mean, Jinx is an incredible creative storyteller, but then technically, and I think only filmmakers will appreciate this story, but she could like say, okay, put on your headphones. Put on my headphones. She said, okay, I want you to go to uh, 26, 32, and 6 frames. Okay, are you there? Yes. Do you hear that slight kind of whoosh under Craig's footsteps? Yes. That doesn't sound. I want you to shorten the sound in the footsteps by 6 frames. So, like that level of preciseness,
I love it.
that's just like when someone is speaking the language of film at such an incredibly sophisticated level, and that only comes with decades and decades and decades of experience.
Mm. I
Yeah.
love that. That's fantastic.
Oh, but I wanted to say about Netflix. Sorry, one more thing. I they always want to make the film better, and they want to make it successful, and they want to feed the algorithm. And that is
Hmm.
tricky. Feeding an algorithm is tricky because I think it's very hard for anybody to understand how these algorithms think.
Hmm.
Often it's kind of you're throwing spaghetti on the wall, I think. But I think I never felt like anything horrific was being imposed on me. I always felt like it was coming from a thoughtful, well-intentioned place, and like I was being respected as a storyteller and a filmmaker.
I've talked to Ava about this too. It's one thing to make the film; it's another thing to market the film. And
Mm,
what was the plan? Like, okay, you guys obviously benefited from the pandemic, but you didn't know that was going to happen.
no.
So, in addition to whatever Netflix was going to do to market the film with the algorithms and stuff, what was your plan, or were you required to have a plan, or not so much?
So because the film was something that Sea Change Project had done, and our whole thing was to make people fall in love with nature, um, and also to promote the kelp forest. We did come up with a plan, and Craig's wife Swati she's an incredible environmental journalist, but she's also worked on a lot of global campaigns. So she came up with this really, really powerful concept, which is the Great African Sea Forest,
Hmm.
because you can't protect something if it doesn't have a name. And before Octopus
Interesting.
Teacher, no one had ever really seen the kelp forest underwater. So um, that was our plan as an organization, was to push forward this idea of the Great African Sea Forest as this very, very special, highly biodiverse, largely unknown place, which needs people to know it and support it. Um, so that was our plan, and we did some PR in South Africa. We built a little website, and then we had no idea. We just had no idea what it means to have a film on Netflix. You can't imagine what it's like to put your work onto a platform like that. You know, you're talking about hundreds of millions of subscribers, and of course, not all of them watch the film. Um, And I don't think there was much of a plan. They kind of said to us, look, the film's going out on the 7th of September. We don't know what press opportunities they're going to be. We knew we'd got into a lot of festivals and they'd all been cancelled because of the pandemic. So we had some inkling that like people liked the film. It dropped on the 7th of September. The next day, our website had crashed and we were getting an email every 3 seconds. And that continued for the next, for months.
Mm-hmm.
And then we started getting all of these press requests, and Netflix said, look, just do the first 2 weeks because after that it'll taper off. But I was still doing press 9 months later. I mean, I'm still talking about Octopus Teacher. It's 5 years later. So it was a strange thing, and I think, I just thought, okay, we're going to make the film, and that's going to take a lot of energy, and that's the job. Promoting it, learning to speak about it, being up at crazy hours because you're working across all time zones and talking to media houses in every part of the world. I was not prepared for that. And I'm quite
What
an
did you have to
introvert.
learn when it came to speaking about it?
I think the easy thing was that I knew it so well, and it had been such a personal journey for me that I had a lot to say.
Right.
Um,
You had to take things away. You had to remove some of the story.
yeah,
Some of the
I had to
details.
remove things. I mean, I think it's an interesting. You kind of have to ask yourself how vulnerable you want to be, even in conversations like this. And I don't know. I mean, I'd be interested to hear what you think, because my inclination is to be very, very honest, and to be as honest and authentic as I can be. And that requires a lot of vulnerability.
Mm-hmm.
But when you're doing 16, 17 interviews a week, you start feeling incredibly drained and exposed.
Mm-hmm.
When you're wearing your heart on the outside of your chest all the time like that. I don't know if you've got any thoughts on that.
There's two things happening. One is, yes, you're having to talk about the same things, answer the same questions over and over and over. But then you're also realizing that I'm getting to talk about the thing that I've been so passionate about for so long.
Yeah.
And, it's been living in this space with these handful of people, and now other people are interested in it. So
Yeah.
I know for myself, when I've been promoting some of my work, I've just tried to stay tapped into to that space of gratitude for just having the opportunity to do it.
Yeah.
And I'm grateful to be tired, and I'm grateful to be, answering the same question that this person has asked me, that clearly they didn't really do any research before they
Yeah.
interview.
Yeah.
But so yeah, I don't know. I've never had anything on the scale of my Octopus Teacher, but but overall, I guess with your situation, you talked about, again, going back a little bit to the anxiety. And I bring that up because I know a lot of people experience that. I personally have never really experienced severe anxiety. I've had a little bit here and there, but
Wow. You are so lucky.
I know I feel very fortunate, to be perfectly
Yeah.
honest with you. But so a lot of times we think that the delusion is that once I become successful, all that's going to go away. And maybe it could even be amplified with all that pressure and success and people wanting your time and attention. Talk a little bit about that.
So I think it's it definitely doesn't go away.
It definitely.
1000% it doesn't go away in my experience.
Success, the Academy Award didn't make it evaporate.
No, it's an incredible thing to go through, to have all of that affirmation. I mean, it's like incredible. Yeah, for part of you, it's like, I guess, everything you could have dreamed of, because it's like the world is saying you are worthwhile and your ideas matter. And that's very much what you were talking about earlier. When you've had all this stuff sitting inside of you and suddenly you've got an opportunity to speak about it, but also it's resonating, and you start feeling much less alone in the world. And that's amazing, because you feel like there are millions and millions of people who understand what this thing inside you is. They think like you. It speaks to them. It moves them. And that's the really beautiful side of it. But at the same time, I think being exposed like that, being on a platform like that, number one, it can be quite intrusive and invasive. So, suddenly I'd meet someone who I'd never seen before in my life, and they'd be like, "Oh, I recognize your voice. You're on the radio. You're that person, aren't you?" And I'd go to the coffee shop, which I'd been going to literally every single day of my life for the last 8 years. And I used to sit there quietly, not talk to anyone, drink my flat white, do my emails, not look left or right, and be in this little bubble. And suddenly everyone's coming up and they want to take photos and they want to talk to you about Octopus Teacher. And now it's 6 months in and you haven't talked about anything but Octopus Teacher for 6 months. And that just starts to feel quite uncomfortable. But I think the biggest thing, and this is where the imposter syndrome, and I've been trying to understand imposter syndrome, and I kind of had some insights in the last few days, but suddenly there's all this expectation around you, and suddenly the world is telling you that, you are talented and your ideas are worthwhile, and you've put something out in the world that moves people, that they like. And not everybody liked it as well, and that's another thing that you have to deal with. But I think the thing with imposter syndrome is what our psyche really struggles to deal with is if we have an idea about ourselves, but it doesn't match, and then it doesn't match up to the experience that we're having in the world. So if you have any sense of inadequacy or unworthiness, if there's some little part of you that hasn't been quite integrated and still doesn't quite believe in itself, and then the whole world is mirroring all of these incredible things back at you, it's very uncomfortable. And you become, that part of you kind of gets bigger and bigger and bigger, because it can't make sense of what's coming its way. And it's a part of your identity, I suppose, that doesn't want to be forgotten. And it's quite a sad thing. Like I wasn't aware that I had these feelings of unworthiness, to be honest. And I think it's 6 years later, and I'm only, 5 years later, and I'm really starting to wrestle with that now. It's taken a long time to understand and get in touch with that kind of core wound, I suppose.
Did you have to incorporate any other practices other than going into the water, like therapy, meditation, anything like that, to kind of help you navigate the post effects of your success?
I did. I've been in therapy. I think I've also just had to learn to slow down quite a lot, because the other thing that happens when you making the film is a massive output of energy. And when you're so excited about something, you don't realize that you're using up like years worth of energy in a very short space of time. And then doing the publicity is another level on top of that. And then there's this kind of thing that's sitting in your psyche, which you're trying to make sense of, which is the imposter syndrome, which is now there are all these expectations of you. And you have to evolve really, really quickly. You've got to learn to deal with a whole new kind of tapestry of challenges. People don't see you the way that they saw you before. Some do, and you'll always be grateful for those people. But it took me a long time to kind of figure out who I was after all that happened.
Mm.
And I think part of that was not taking on as much, so that you have time to kind of integrate and process, making sure that I got it. It was actually very, very simple stuff, because working so hard for so long, working across all the time zones, the anxiety that came with the imposter syndrome, one thing it really affected was my sleep.
Mm.
And when you're not sleeping properly, you cannot, your personality starts to change. You can't function, as the best version of yourself. So I had to become actually very protective around getting enough hours of sleep every night. I mean, I think that's the biggest thing. That the simplest way of putting it is, the main practice I learned was how to set boundaries, and when to set boundaries, and what it means to really say no. I'd never had to do that before. I'd never had so many people. I'd never had, I mean, suddenly you've just got all these incredible opportunities, and everybody is interested in what you have to say, and it's wonderful. What an incredible privilege. So learning when to say no to those things, because even though it's amazing, it's just not good for you at that time, because you don't have the capacity to meet all of those demands and do justice to those opportunities. It's a process.
Hey, really quickly, if you like this content or if you don't like it, let me know down in the comments, because your likes and comments are going to help me learn what you want more of. And then that way I can keep bringing you the good stuff. All right. Thanks so much for your feedback, and back to the show. And then from a filmmaking perspective, what were some of the takeaways that you got from that collaboration you took that into your next project, your second feature?
Yeah. So my second feature was very different. I was co-directing again, but I was very much the kind of secondary director on that project. It was a completely different film. It was a very fascinating story, very, very dark, and confronting. Much more, I mean, interesting in that it was also the story about the impact of nature and wilderness on the human psyche. But where Octopus Teacher was this beautiful story of healing and connection, My Mercury, which is the other film, is much more about kind of isolation and the brutality of the natural world. And the story is about this young conservationist who was in his late 20s, who went to live all on his own on an island off the coast of Namibia. And his job was to restore this island for these incredible bird colonies that had been living there. So it was like this absolute mecca for seabirds, and seabirds are very, very threatened. Their numbers are plummeting all over the world. So his job was to make this island a place where seabirds could thrive. The problem was, because of a whole lot of historical things that had been caused by humans, the island was being taken over by seals. So he was left with this dilemma where he had to find a way of chasing the seals off the island to make room for the seabirds. And he goes deeper and deeper and deeper into this kind of crazy one-man war against this invasion.
What drew you to this project?
It was fascinating. The material was really, really fascinating. Most of it is the self-shot, like almost Castaway style handycam footage, where right. Eve, the main character, he names his video camera and he's talking to his video camera all the time, and he's got an amazing sense of humor. And he's just like this beautiful wild guy out there by himself. And then he films his own unraveling. And it's really, really powerful material. It's rare, and it's shot over 8 years. To have that much material
So it's the same thing.
Crazy.
Like when you came into Octopus Teacher, Craig had already archived or filmed all the octopus
Yeah,
footage for the
yeah,
most part,
yeah.
and you kind of helped to shape the story. So you kind of did the same thing with My Mercury.
Yes. And I was working with Jinx Godfrey again, who was the
Hmm.
editor who I mentioned earlier. So she was the editor. I really wanted to work with her again. So I was super
Hmm.
excited about that opportunity. And then Joelle Cheselet, she is the main director, and then Eve is her brother. So it was a very, very personal story for her. And it was something she'd been working on for like 30
Mm.
years, you know,
Mm.
because they're both in their 70s now. And that footage happened, or maybe in their 60s. He started filming himself when he was in his late 20s.
Hmm.
Um,
So what translated from the Craig dynamic to this Joel Eve dynamic, and what didn't quite translate from your experiences
I
as a
think,
filmmaker and storyteller?
I mean, I think it was a completely different film. I don't know if anything really translated.
I just mean
I
in
think
terms
there's
of
some.
telling the story of shaping the story. Obviously, they wanted you to bring some of that My Octopus Teacher magic to
Mm,
to their
they did.
film.
They did. And there was a lot of kind of expectation around that. But it was
Hmm.
just such a different film. It was, the subject matter was so much more challenging and confronting. The island is this harsh, it looks like God put his hand down, if you believe in God, and ripped the top of a mountain and just like slapped it in the ocean. And it's this piece of rock that rises out of the middle of nowhere, many,
Wow.
many hours from civilization.
Hmm.
And everything is harsh and windy. There is kelp forest, but the water's just like wild all the time. So you're not going underground into this beautiful cathedral like wonderland.
Hmm.
You're kind of stomping through guano, being roared at by seals. So I don't know, and I'm so glad that I did such a different story. Yes, so I guess the similarity is that you're pretty much inside one person's mind, and
Hmm.
you're experiencing this thing through their eyes. But it's a very different experience, um, and I think it really force if the viewers get it and if they engage with it fully, they are left with having to ask themselves some very, very difficult questions about what it means to be human and the kinds of choices that we have to make in
Right.
the world as it stands, particularly in terms of our relationship with the natural world.
I'd also imagine that having gone through your experiences with Jinx, like that very granular style of editing, and then just having edited the 4 passes with Netflix,
Yeah.
like that would translate as well. Because once you go through that crucible of editing, it allows you to see what someone has through a different lens, and you can immediately
Yeah.
or almost immediately say, "This is great. That's not probably. I know you're attached to that, but that doesn't." You can kind of
And
piecemeal it
that
together
was a
a lot quicker.
nice. Because I hadn't been making the film for 30 years like Joelle, I did have perspective.
Yeah,
So I could
you were
take
like the
on,
James and combined
yeah,
with the Pippa.
yeah, very much. And I
Yeah.
guess what was powerful as well, because I'd had that experience with James, because when you're making a film, I mean, Joelle had been making that film for 30 years. I've been doing Octopus Teacher for 3. It was different, but it's like your baby. You are breathing, dreaming, living that thing every day. It's like this little seed of something that's growing inside of you. It's scary to share it with someone else. And you do, and it brings up all kinds of fears around, are they going to take me seriously? Am I going to get pushed around? Um, am I going to be steamrolled out of the creative process? So, because I'd already lived with all of those fears, um, I think I could be sensitive to where Joelle was. Co-directing is challenging. Yeah.
Oh, I can't even imagine. Yeah.
It's really challenging.
I know for myself, I'm super like picky. I don't want to have to get someone else's permission to do something
Yeah,
that
yeah,
feels right to
and you
me.
have to. You really have to collaborate. Every decision is a collaboration. Yeah,
Hmm. Hmm.
yeah.
What's the secret to making a collaboration thrive then? You just can't take things personally.
Yeah, I guess trying not to take things personally, always being respectful and
Hmm.
sensitive. Um, for me, I think the biggest thing is like sometimes realizing that often it's not going to make a huge difference one way or another, and
Yeah.
both ways could work, and just being willing sometimes to let it go. And often what happens is you'll like concede, and the process will continue and continue and continue, and then it'll get to a point and it'll come back to kind of where you thought it should be,
Yeah.
but then the other person's been through that process, so they can come to terms with it. So much about creating things is the process that you have to go through inside of yourself to get there.
I also find that having a well articulated and simplified mission statement or vision statement
Yeah, it
that you can
helps.
refer back to, does this align with our mission or doesn't it? Because it's cute, it's clever,
Yeah,
it's insightful, et cetera. But at
I
the
think
end
you've
of the
got to be.
day, yeah, tell me.
Yeah, well, no, I think if you're working with a brand, if you're working with an organization, then I agree with that.
Hmm.
And maybe even if you're doing a narrative, if you're making a drama. Um, but I think with documentary filmmaking, you have to be flexible because there the material has to kind of tell its own story to some degree. And I think it's dangerous to be too attached to a specific vision because you start to manipulate and impose too much on the
Right.
story.
I agree. And I would say that when I'm imagining when I say that is
Mm,
kind of like you said, Craig's thing is magical realism. So that's got to be a part of this, right?
for
And
sure.
if something is being too scientific, even though it makes sense, even though it explains everything, but it's not really aligned with the this this magical realism tone that I would ultimately like for this project to have. And so that could be it could be as simple as that. Like that's the vision or that's the mission for this. And everybody has to agree on it, by the way. It's not like
Yeah.
you can move the goalpost, in the middle of the filmmaking
Yeah.
process.
No, I mean,
Unless
I think
everybody agrees to.
yeah, and I think we were quite aligned on the kind of stone and tile style, storytelling language. But
Mhm.
film is a complex thing. It is multi layered, and there are thousands upon thousands of decisions to be made along the way,
Mhm.
um,
Mhm.
and tiny little things to nitpick over with your collaborators. So, I mean, you have the same thing. It's a very interesting working with an editor. An editor is almost like a co-director to a
Oh
degree,
yeah.
and I had the same in my last film, the one I just finished with Dan Schwalm, who I was editing with.
Mhm.
Yeah, we argued a lot. Not in a kind of aggressive way, but that's what you want. You want someone you
Mhm.
can really like interrogate something with, and
Yeah.
who does kind of put their foot down and say what they think. Because we all, you wouldn't be doing this job unless you really cared about it and were invested.
Mhm.
So everyone's just trying to make the film better.
I remember
And
in that movie Bohemian Rhapsody. Did you see that movie with
I
yeah,
did.
what
I did.
so the Freddie Mercury character.
Remy Malik.
Yeah, at the end of the
Yeah.
movie, once the band had broken up, and he was with his other studio musicians. He tried to get the band back together. He said the thing I miss the most is when you guys would push back on my
Yeah.
ideas.
Yeah.
Like that was crucial to the
It
creative
makes it
process. I
better.
don't want people just agreeing to everything that I say.
Yeah.
I want someone to have an opinion.
Yeah. And I kind of figured that out with Netflix on this last film. I kept getting notes and then like working really hard to try and address their notes. And then and thinking, okay, well, I can't just say no. I've got to at least try. And by the end, I was just getting on calls and just saying, look, I just don't want to do that. And they were actually very respectful of it. And I was like,
I could have been doing this the whole time.
Yeah, why have I been like bending myself into a pretzel? And it's not. I mean, they're trying to make it better. They're making suggestions, but for me, I guess that's been the biggest learning after all of these things is that you can't be too self-conscious in your filmmaking process. You have to back yourself, and you have to trust that while outsiders might be able to see things that you can't, nobody knows the blueprint and the deep kind of invisible foundations of that story better than you do.
Mm-hmm. All right. So someone listening to this has an idea for telling a story. It could be a film, it could be a book, it could be, a podcast. You've done all of those. What are your suggested steps, first steps? Like they have this clear vision, this dream, this idea. They kind of know, the gist of it. What do they do next?
So I'm going to just ignore the current political media climate because I think we're not going to talk about AI or politics or anything else because it makes it too complex. I think if you have this idea and it's like literally burning a hole inside of your soul and you feel like you're going to die if you can't make it, I think that's kind of the first thing when you're starting out, because it's so hard to finish a big creative process like that you have to really, really believe in it. You can't have any doubt in your mind that this is something that you want to do. The next thing is to make sure that it's a very powerful story. And I think this is a mistake that lots of people make. And there are all kinds of different formulas to doing things, and you can make a super, I guess, poetic kind of abstract short film. But there is something around storytelling in its kind of classic form, having a powerful character that people can relate to in some way, that they either want to root for or they want to see their demise. Knowing that person is going to go on a journey and be transformed in some way. I mean, these are the things that this is why storytelling has worked for thousands and thousands of years. It's not enough to say, I'm going to make a film about climate change, for example. Mm-hmm. It's too vague. Like, you have to be able to sit down and tell someone the story of whatever your project is about, whether it's a book or a podcast or a film, and you've got to be able to take them on a journey in like 90 seconds. Otherwise, you have not refined your ideas enough. And the other thing I'd say, especially if you're making a film, is you really have to pick the right. If your film is about a human with animals, lots of my films are about animals, but if your film is about a human, you have to make sure that subject is fascinating to you and kind of multi-dimensional enough to hold a 90-minute story if it's a feature, and B, that you're happy to be like friends with this person for a really long time, or be open to the idea that you might discover something about them that you don't like. That's kind of fundamental. And then if you still want to make the film, you're going to have to deal with falling out with that person and whatever that might mean in terms of you're going to be, if you make a film about someone, for better or worse, you're going to have a relationship with that person, possibly for the rest of your life, one way or another. And to be very cognizant of that. And there's a big responsibility that comes with that as well. If someone trusts you enough to tell their story, it's a huge leap of faith. on their part. What else would I say? Find mentors. That's
Yeah, I
the
was going to say, how do
biggest
you
thing.
attract collaborators and mentors, especially if you don't have a big budget? Like, how do you inspire people to want to help you?
I think what we were speaking about at the beginning of the conversation is huge. Showing that you are going to show up no matter what. Showing that you're like hungry to make this thing work. And then, of course, being kind of confident and willing to back yourself, but also going in with that humility and a kind of sense of humor about it, and being willing to admit that you don't know everything and you're going to need support and guidance, and open to taking that feedback. But yeah, it's just having a really powerful idea that you can express, because that's the other challenge, and I've struggled with it a lot at the beginning of my career. Is I'd have all these amazing ideas, but I didn't know how to articulate them.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe I'd start, and then someone else would like come in and they'd express my idea much better than me, and everybody else would get it, and I'd be like, oh, but I mean, that's what I've been trying to say. But I just didn't know how to say it yet, and it's a skill to learn to tell your story in a cohesive and powerful way.
Beautiful.
You have to practice. You got to like look in the mirror and tell it to yourself. Especially, yeah, if you're going to be pitching things.
Are you giving keynotes, or are you just focused on your filmmaking for now?
So I'm actually going to do a talk next week.
Nice.
At a festival called Exposure in the UAE.
Are you nervous?
I am quite nervous because I haven't done one for a long time. I'm trying to think. I mean, because I work with Sea Change, we do quite a lot of kind of ocean talks. So I did one in September last year, but there was a time where I was doing a lot of keynotes. Mm-hmm. But I haven't for a while. And it is, when you're in a film, like, you got to be so laser focused.
Yeah, you got to be locked in.
Yeah.
Beautiful. Well, look, thank you so much for joining my podcast and being so vulnerable in this conversation.
Thanks,
What's a good way for people to kind of get more familiar with your body of work? Where should they start? Should they start with My Mercury? Should they start with Octopus Teacher? Your podcast?
Start with Octopus Teacher. If you haven't seen it, check out Sea Change Project, because that is this like organization that it's just this amazing kind of hive mind of human beings who we all love the kelp forest, and we love storytelling, and we love the natural world, and we're trying to make sense of things, and really trying to figure out how to share these stories in a way that people can connect to. I'm really proud of Back to the Water, which is the podcast that we've only done one episode of 8. That the others will be coming in the next 18 months, I think. And that's a project that was very much inspired by my Octopus Teacher, and inspired by some of the pushback that I got from Octopus Teacher in South Africa. And it's a podcast that I've co-hosting with a good friend of mine, Zolani Mahola. And it looks into the relationships between different South Africans and the ocean, and how those relationships have been affected by a history of kind of unspeakable injustice in our country. And then look out for Pangolin, Kulu's Journey, which is the next film. And that will come out on the 21st of April on Netflix.
Oh, wow. Okay. Yeah. Beautiful. You're not very active on social media. Like, you're not into the whole personal brand thing. It doesn't seem to be. You're more like you push your nonprofits and everything, but you don't really have, like, I don't even think your Instagram is under your name. It's under Rewilding or something like
It's
that.
under
Is
the
that?
rewilding. Well, it's kind of a throwback. I mean, I'm actually interested. What are your thoughts on social media and personal branding?
I don't know. I mean, look, if you have something that you think is going to inspire people, maybe.
Yeah.
Um, I definitely, I'm very intentional about posting.
Mm.
If it was just up to me, I probably wouldn't be that engaged in social media. But um,
Who's it up to?
well, it is up to me. But I have a community. I have like a community
Yeah.
of people, and it's all very organic. And so that's kind of how I disseminate information is through social media
Yeah.
and my podcast and stuff like that. Like when I want people to know about this conversation. So, you know,
Yeah, and
I
that's where it's
consider,
powerful.
yeah, I consider investing in my social media a way to get attention for things like this that I think are going to be very helpful for people. So,
Yeah.
but I don't
That.
necessarily enjoy doom scrolling. I do enjoy creating content though.
Well, I think that's a really healthy way of approaching it.
Hmm.
Um, I can get sucked into doom scrolling, which I'm not
We
proud
can
to
all,
admit.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I guess I'm just in a, before so the success of Octopus Teacher, I actually really liked social media. I loved Instagram. I loved putting my photos out there and talking about the kind of quirky little unexpected experiences I was having on a daily basis in the kelp forest. But I
Hmm.
think my life kind of changed so much so suddenly, and I guess I didn't have as much capacity for it. Um,
Hmm.
and I am quite private, so
Hmm.
I don't. I put work stuff on there, but um, maybe I'll find my peace with it at some point. This year, I'm probably not going to make a film, except for one that I'm finishing. But I'm not going to start a new one uh, because I think. Sorry, I know we need to wrap up, but I think in life you go through these phases, and I've had since 2017, so that's nearly 10 years, like 8 years of just extreme outputting and being very very focused. And I suppose creating things in a very structured way, actually. Filmmaking is very structured.
Hmm.
And then I think you also need to go through phases of life where you are inhaling rather than exhaling, and where you can give space and time to your kind of internal world and see what percolates and what kind of energy and inspiration that gives you. And I think that will feed into whatever I make next. Um, and maybe I'll come back onto social media, but I'm not sure.
Do you have an idea of where you're going to be doing all this inhaling during this sabbatical from filmmaking after this
Well, I
project is
wouldn't
done?
call it a sabbatical. I would say I'm just giving myself some time to figure out what the next thing's going to be.
Mhm.
Um, I am probably going to be at home and diving a lot,
Mhm.
um, and
Yeah,
working
the
with
last
sea
time we talked,
change.
you said you hadn't been in the ocean in a little while.
No, no, it was crazy. It was so, and the weather was good. The conditions were good. No, I was just in front of that edit suite. Um, and then I kind of delivered most of the film just before Christmas. And since then, I've just been diving and doing multi-day hikes with my friends with no cell phone. And I feel much more like myself. And I'm feeling really,
Mhm.
really happy and really good and really excited actually for this next film to come out. Um, and that, that's going to require, I mean, I say I'm not making another film, but there's going to be an awful lot of work to do
Mhm.
with that one still. Um,
Quick question
yeah.
about returning to the forest, the sea forest. Is that something
Yes,
you go in by yourself, or do you have to have, or do you prefer to have people to go in there with you?
both. I've had like really incredible dives on my own, I guess it all just depends on where you're at and what your intention is. And then if I go in with people who I kind of trust in the water, and we sort of move like this little silent school together, and we don't splash and scare animals away, and we're on the same wavelength, then I really like diving with people. And and it's an incredibly bonding thing. It's like you build your tribe because you have these powerful experiences in the water together.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you have a little preamble that you give them, your friends who've gone out there with you for maybe the first time, about seeing the magic or witnessing the magic?
Yes. Sometimes we say a little kind of very circular prayer around, which helps you to set an intention. I think, and these are the things that I have to keep reminding myself of, because when you go into a space with openness and curiosity and are not too attached to any particular outcome, when you just like kind of there in a very humble way, I suppose, that's when you start to see amazing things. And have, just awe-inspiring experiences. We've had really strange, warm water here for most of December, January, which is, it's always a bit warmer in summer, but this has been like 22, 25 degrees Celsius sometimes, which is crazy. But then once or twice, what's happened is that the temperature's dropped very suddenly to like 11 degrees. And that shocks all of the marine creatures. They don't know what to do. And there'll be this little pocket of warm water in a little patch of kelp forest very close to where I live. And we've been going in there, and it's like every single fish in the neighborhood has come because they've got a big fright and they're trying to be warm. And you'll just be swimming around in this tiny patch of water surrounded by thousands upon thousands upon thousands of fish, and fish that don't normally hang out together are suddenly swimming around in a big school in a giant circle all around you. And it's just, magic realism. So
the word
that's
got
been a really
around
cool
that
thing.
the warm water's over there.
Yeah.
Let's all head over there.
Yeah. And everybody's there. Even the guys that normally live far out to sea, they're all like sheltering in the warm patch. Yeah.
Well, Pippa, thank you so much. Thank you. I really appreciate this.
Thank you, Light.
And it's a wonderful conversation. One of my favorites. And I'll let you know when this is out. I can't wait for other people to hear it.
Thank you. And thank you so much for reaching out to me. I really appreciate it. It's a great, great honor.
Thank you so much for watching. Just FYI, we post a new video almost every day, so make sure you comment and subscribe below so you don't miss out on anything. And if you enjoyed this video, I think you're really going to love this one as well. And if you ever want to see a playlist of all of my podcasts or all of the plot twists or any other category of videos, you can find links to those in the description below.